In this problem, we're going to be talking about the removeNextByFlavor method, which attempts to remove and return one piece of candy from the box. The piece of candy to be removed is the first piece of candy with a flavor equal to the parameter flavor that is encountered while traversing the candy box in the following order. The last row of the box is traversed from left to right, and the next to last row of the box is traversed from left to right until either a piece of candy with the desired flavor is found or until the entire candy box has been searched. If the method finds a candy object with a desired flavor, the corresponding box element is assigned null, all other box elements are unchanged, and the removed candy object is returned. Otherwise, box is unchanged and the method returns null. So let's go ahead and start off with some pseudocode to sort of orient ourselves. It's interesting with our traversal of this 2D array is going to be a little bit different than the way that we normally do it, where we start at the first row and we go through it column by column. Here we're kind of flipping that a little bit. So we're looping starting from the last row to the first row. And then the way that we loop through the columns is very similar to how we normally loop through columns. We loop starting from the first column to the last column. Okay, and so then what are we doing inside of these loops? We want to grab the piece of candy from that row in that column, if it exists, right? So it could be that at that row in that column there is no candy, it's null. So first we need to check if there is a piece of candy. And then second, what we need to check is actually that it matches the flavor that's being passed in, and its flavor matches flavor, where this is like the parameter. Remove the piece of candy from the box and return it. Remember, our return type for this method is candy, so we're either returning the piece of candy that we found that matches that flavor, or null if it's not in the box. So this is all of our looping logic. So outside of our for loop, we're going to return null if that flavor of candy is not in the box. So this happens once we're done looping through every row and every column and we couldn't find a piece of candy that was that flavor. We would just return null. So we can go ahead and start writing out our code. So for int, I'm going to say name this looping variable row. We want to start at the very last row. So the way that we can do that is, so box.length represents how many rows there are in the 2D array. Now we need to subtract 1 from it, because if we just use box.length, we would get an array index out of bounds error because the rows are 0 index. So we want to start at the last row. We want to make sure, what condition do we want to make sure a row is? We want to make sure a row is greater than or equal to 0. So we keep looping until we reach the first row in our 2D array. And then instead of incrementing it, like the way that we did in the last problem, we're going to be decrementing our row variable, okay? So then we want to loop starting from the first column to last column. This is kind of the way that we always do it. So we start off at 0, we make sure it's less than the number of columns in the 2D array. So the way that we can grab that is we can get the length of the first array, which is the first row. That'll give us the number of columns. In these tests, you can assume that these 2D arrays, each of them has the same number of columns. So that's why I'm just using the length of the first row, because that'll be the length of all of our rows, or the length, or how many columns there are in all of our rows. Okay, so we can just go ahead and use that. And then we want to, sorry, I used I here. We need to use call. Then we want to increment call. Okay, so those are our 2 for loops. Next, what we need to do is grab the piece of candy from the row in that column. So create a new candy variable. Let me just name it something boring like candy. And 2D arrays are row major. So the first number that we need to pass in is the row index. So we're using our row looping variable. And then the second one is the call, which is the column number. Okay, so we grab that. Then if there is actually a piece of candy and its flavor matches flavor, we want to remove it from the box and return it. So this is going to be an if statement. So we need to make sure that there is actually a piece of candy. So imagine that at that row in that column, there was no piece of candy and it was actually null. We need to first check that candy does not equal null. Why do we need to do this? Well, the next thing we're going to do is call this getFlavor method on that piece of candy. And if it's null, we're going to get an error. So this is really, really essential because otherwise our code is going to crash. So we also want to check that candy.getFlavor is equal to this flavor parameter that's passed in. So we don't want to use equals equals here since this is string comparison. These are both strings. We're going to do dot equals. So dot equals flavor. Okay. So what happens if it equals a flavor? That means that we found the piece of candy that was flavored the way that we were looking for. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove it from the box. So at that row, at that column, we now do not have a piece of candy anymore. We're setting that value equal to null. And then since I guess someone's going to be eating this piece of candy, we're returning it. So return candy, lowercase candy, the one that represents our variable that we found. And that should be it for our looping logic. If at no point in our looping logic did we find a piece of candy that had that flavor, we're going to have to return null. So return null if the flavor of candy is not in the box. And this should be all of our logic for the removeNextByFlavor method. So let's go ahead and do these sample calls to make sure that our code actually works. So here's what our candy box looks like before we've called any methods on it. So the first method call is removing a cherry flavored piece of candy. So let's go ahead and so we set row equal to box.length -1. So this is going to be 2. We need to make sure that's greater than or equal to 0. Yes, it is. We need to set column equal to 0 and make sure that's less than the number of columns. So less than 5. We have 5 columns. That also is true. So we grab the candy at box 2, 0, 2, 0, which is a very convenient, it's a cherry flavored piece of candy. So maybe I'll write it like this, cherry, because this is going to be a candy object. So it does not equal null, right? There's actually a piece of candy at that row, at that column. And then when we call candy.getFlavor, it's going to return cherry. And then cherry does equal cherry. So what we're going to do is we're going to set that element equal to null. So there's no longer a piece of cherry candy in the third row, first column, and we're going to return the candy. So we're going to return this candy object. That matches up with what the 2D array looks like after we call removeNextByFlavor, where the cherry flavored candy is gone. Okay, the next flavor of candy we want to return is lime. So let's go ahead and do the same thing we did last time. So we're setting row equal to box.length -1. So 2, we're starting off at row 2. Make sure that's greater than or equal to 0. It is. We set column equal to 0. Make sure that's less than box.length. So that's the number of columns, which is 5. So we grab the candy at box 2, 0. There is no candy there. Remember, we just removed it. So it's not going to pass this null check. So we're going to have to continue looping through the rest of the box of candy. So what we're going to do is we're going to increment our column. Remember that our row is going to stay the same. We're still looking at the last row in our box. So we want to see if the candy at 2, 1 is lime flavored. There is no candy there. So we have to keep looking. We have to increment our column again. So now we're looking at 2, 2. This is a lemon flavored piece of candy. So it would actually pass this null check, but it doesn't pass the flavor check. So we have to keep looking. 2, 3, there's no candy here. Doesn't pass the null check. Move on. 2, 4 is an orange flavored piece of candy. So it passes the null check, but it doesn't pass the flavor check. So we have to move on. At this point, 5 is no longer less than 5. So we have to go up to our outer loop and decrement it. So now we're looking at the second to last row. We can restart our column to 0 and let's go ahead and start looking again. So is box 1, 0, does it have a piece of lime flavored candy? No, it does not. It has an orange flavored piece of candy, which would pass the null check, but doesn't pass the flavor check. Increment our column Does 1, 1 have a piece of candy? No, it does not. It fails the null check. Increment our column. Also will fail the null check. There's no piece of candy there. Then when we increment our column to 3, we're now looking at 1, 3. There is actually a piece of lime candy there. So we pass this null condition. So this is a candy and the flavor is lime. So it passes the null condition and it passes the flavor condition because lime is equal to lime. So we're going to set box at 1, 3 to be null. And then we're going to return this lime flavored candy. But this is what the updated contents of the box looks like after we call removeNextByFlavor. The last method call is removeNextByFlavor grape. So once again, we're starting off at the last row, so that's 2. We're going to make sure that's greater than or equal to 0. We start our column at 0, make sure that's less than 5. We grab the candy at row 2, column 0, which is null. There is no piece of candy there, so we have to increment our column. Also is not a piece of candy there. We have to increment our column again. Here we have a lemon flavored piece of candy, which is not what we're looking for, so increment our candy again, our column again. 2, 3, there's no candy there, it fails the null check, increment the column again. 2, 4 is an orange flavored piece of candy, which does not match the grape that we're trying to find, so we increment column again. At this point, 5 is no longer less than 5, so we need to decrement our outer loop. So now it's 1, row 1, and we reset our column. So we're looking at 1, 0. 1, 0 has an orange flavored piece of candy. Unfortunately, that does not match grape. Increment our column. We're looking at 1, 1, empty, null, does not pass the null check. Increment the column again. 1, 2, also null, does not pass the null check. 1, 3, null, there is no piece of candy there, so doesn't pass the null check. And then the last column in that row is a lime piece of candy, which does not match our flavor. So once again, we try to increment our column. 5 is not less than 5. We decrement our row. So now we're looking at the first row in our box of candy. So restart our column to 0 again. So now we're looking at 0, 0. 0, 0 has a lime flavored piece of candy, doesn't match the flavor. So increment our column. 1, 0, 1 is lime, does not match. We move on to the second column, which is null, doesn't pass the null check. Move on to the third column, which is a lemon flavored candy, is not the flavor we're looking for. So we go to the last column in our first row, which is empty. There's no piece of candy there. It doesn't pass the null check. We try to increment our column again. 5 is not less than 5, so we're going to try to decrement our row. So now we have -1. -1 is no longer greater than or equal to 0, so we're done looping actually. We couldn't find a grape flavored piece of candy in the box. We loop through every single row and column. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to return null because that flavor of candy was not in the box, and the contents of the box of candy is unchanged because we did not remove any candy from it because we didn't actually find any of it. If we remove all of our pseudocode, here is what our removeNextByFlavor method looks like. Hopefully this helps you out with this problem. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below and I'll get back to you, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.